Reno is experiencing a sort of Motown revival on Saturday, May 19th. The Contours and Martha Reeves of Martha and the Vandellas are performing with the Reno Philharmonic at Pioneer Center. And today, we're getting a little lesson in Motown history from a Michigan musicologist and from Motown's founding publicist. It's a conversation about Motown magic. Guests today are Al Abrams, the first publicist of the record label that became Motown, and Mark Clague, Associate Professor of Musicology and Director of Research at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. And Al, we're going to spend a lot of time talking to you about your Motown memories, but first I have to start with you, Mark. I have to ask the obvious question. What is a musicologist?
What is a musicologist? Well, ologist is basically someone who studies and writes about any topic. It comes from the Greek word logos, and so I'm basically a music historian, but I study music, and it's a fascinating topic, and you know, something I just feel lucky to be able to study something I love so much.
And you also study some of the interaction between music and society. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you a little bit later about what you've learned about Reno's music history. And
well, with Motown, we have a portmanteau of the word motor and town, which refers to the auto industry in the city of Detroit. But there's something special about the sound and spirit of Detroit that's captured in Motown music.
And Motown is the way we remember it. Al, how do you define Motown, and how did you get involved?
I was 18 years old. I was working for an ad agency, working with madmen, actually. I mean, the depiction is absolutely correct. And I was in a mailroom, and one of the benefits that I had in the mailroom is that I could take, it was McCann Erickson, had a big automotive account, they had Buick, is that I could take the company car home on the weekends, so I could listen to all the, the great music that I wanted to hear, all the, the black music on the African-American radio stations, but I had to get the car back, Monday morning at 5 o'clock. But I would always forget to change the channels, so that when one of the big execs, from the agency got on and was looking for WJR or one of the, local news shows, he'd get hit with this blaring, rock and roll music out of Motown. I was making early converts there. But a friend of mine had heard that we could pick up some extra money by driving recording artists around to what were called record hops at the time. Those are dances sponsored by disc jockeys, and if an artist was coming into town to promote a record, the artist would do the dance for the disc jockey for free, in return for which the disc jockey would have to wail or play the record, very heavily all week long. So yeah, it sounded like a great thing, exposure to records, so why not? A friend of mine said, okay, let's go over and talk to this guy and see if we can pick up this extra money, on the weekends. I took the day off and went with my friend, but it was in the inner city. And my friend was a little, reluctant to, take on a job to work with the African Americans. So my friend we met Berry Gordy. I heard the music playing on his record player, and I thought, oh wow, this is great stuff. I could smell this great smell of chili being cooked in his apartment by the woman that was taking care of Berry, and Reno was his future wife's child. And I thought, well, I really like this place. But they didn't like me. I said, oh, wow, I take the job when my friend didn't get it. But in order to get rid of me, Berry Gordy reached into this pile of records that he had produced. Now, at the time, he would charge $100 to produce a record and deliver a finished record, to anybody who came along.
So I could come along and say, I want to be a singing artist. I pay him $100. He makes me a record.
You're a star.
Okay.
Yeah. He reached it and he pulled out the worst possible record. The worst record he's ever made in his career. I mean, the record was so bad. It was by an artist named Mike Powers. And on one side of the label, he was Mike Power. And on the other side, he was Mike Powers. So I had to decide eventually, what I was going to call him. I went for the plural. But Berry gave me the record and he said, look, kid, take this record. If you can get this record played, on the radio, come back and I'll give you a job. And I'm going, oh, wow, yeah, hey, great, thanks. Unbeknownst to me, of course, I leave, and Berry turns, as I later, found out, Berry turns to Reno and says, boy, don't worry about it. We're never going to see that white boy again. Next day is Memorial Day, 1959. A very hot day. I know that from listening to the R&B stations on the company car, which I fortunately had, I went out to see one of the disc jockeys broadcasting live, a remote, from out on Tyreman Road. I knocked on the window where he was. It was Larry Dixon from WCHB, and he said, what do you want, kid? And I held up the record, and I said, would you play this record? He looked at the record. He must have known somehow or other. And he said, oh, no, go away, get lost. Yeah, I wouldn't. 5 minutes later, would you please play this record? Would you please play this record? No, get lost. 4 hours. I was out. I mean, the show was on 4 hours. 3 hours and 45 minutes. I'm begging. And finally, Larry Dixon feels sorry for me. He says, give me that blank record, puts it on the air. It's the only time the record ever got played anywhere on the air. Again, unbeknownst to me, because it's Memorial Day, Barry and Ray are driving on Belle Isle, which is a vacation spot that a lot of inner city Detroiters like. It's in the middle of the Detroit River. Windsor in Canada on the one side, Detroit on the other side. They had their choice of 2 R&B rhythm and blues stations to listen to. As luck would have it, they listened to WCHB, the station that played the record, and as I later heard, Barry almost lost control of the car, almost drove into the Detroit River, and told Ray Noma, wow, the white kid got the record played. He must be a promotion genius. Well, of course, I don't know that Barry heard this. So the next day I show up at the house, knock on the door. This time, total different reaction. Barry answers the door, gives me a bear hug, brings me in, wow, that was great. I'm beaming in this, like, of course, sure, I know how to get records played. And if you've ever heard that Berry Gordy is one of the toughest negotiators in the industry, it's true. But I got the best of him that day. I went to work for him for $15 a week and all the chili I could eat.
$15 a week. So here you are, an 18-year-old white Jewish kid with no experience, and you go to work promoting what's going to become one of the biggest record labels.
Right. And I also take on the public relations aspect. Now, because Mike Powers lived in Windsor, Ontario, where he was, he's a Yugoslavian immigrant, he's working as a dishwasher, I figured, okay, now I'm going to get him some newspaper publicity, which impresses Barry. All I know from newspaper publicity and how public PR people work is from watching a movie called The Sweet Smell of Success with Tony Curtis and Burt Lancaster. Burt Lancaster plays a Walter Winchell type character. Tony Curtis plays a pretty sleazy PR guy who will do anything to get into the paper.
Which you adopted as a role model.
I adopted as a role model. So I show up and I take I take Mike Powers to the office of the Windsor Star, and I tell the editor there about Mike Powers' great fan club. He's going on this big tour all across Canada, all across the U.S. He's got 5,000 people in his fan club already. Now, with all due respect to Mike Powers, he shows up. He's wearing this pork pie hat, like if you remember the original Ocean's 11, where the Frank Sinatra one where they walk around saying ring-a-ding-ding, that type of thing. If a guy looking like Mike Powers and dressed like him in his age was to record a song called Teenage Sweetheart Today, they'd book him. That's it, guy. That's it. So we get this story, and the story comes out. I take the tunnel bus back over to Windsor, and I get the copies for Barry, and I give him to Barry. Now Barry thinks, "Wow, I'm really a genius." Mike Powers cuts disc. It's the first ever mention of anything to be Motown, and now here I am. I'm PR guy, and I'm national record promotion director for Berry Gordy's publishing company, and the works.
And of course, Motown went on to be much bigger then. You had, I suppose, the Supremes were the big break.
The Supremes were the big break, but that wasn't until 1964. They were around for a number of years. First as the Primettes. Here they are in my office signing autographs.
They just look like really innocent young women.
Yeah, they were. Florence, one of my favorite people, now deceased. Diana Ross and Mary Wilson. Mary Wilson lives here in the state. This is a big breakthrough, getting the Supremes on the cover of a TV magazine. Up until that point, believe it or not, and it's hard to believe, in 1965, no African-American artist had ever been on the cover of a TV guide.
Now that's amazing. Even though they were obviously on TV, we were watching Black Stars then.
Yeah, you were watching the Ed Sullivan Show,
right?
Hullabaloo, and that's what predicated my visit to the editor, and I said, look, they're on, they're local. The TV magazine that you saw was produced in Detroit by one of the two newspapers there.
But it showed in four major
Yeah, it showed in, actually 3 of the newspapers are now defunct in the other markets, so I don't know what that means. Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, the Evening Star, the Houston Chronicle, and the New York Journal-American, the old Hearst paper, and of course the Detroit News. I said, hey, look, they're all over the place. They're a local act. They've had 3 #1 hits in a row. Why can't we put them on the cover of the TV magazine? And the editor looks at me and says, oh, yeah, we can't put, black people on the cover of a TV magazine. And I said, well, why not? And so people keep this magazine in their living rooms all week long. You can't have them looking down at this and have, these black faces looking back up at them. And I said, well, if people don't like it, they can turn it over and look at the house ad on the back. It doesn't work that way. So I get up to leave, and the editor, says, hey, come in my office. I want to talk to you. Something I've always wanted to ask you. Now, you have to remember, this is this is 1960. This is the very, very start of the civil rights movement. In this country, we're very polarized, especially in Detroit. The editor said, basically, there's a question I want to ask you. What's a nice Jewish boy like you doing, working for, and he uses the N-word, and I'm ready for this. I mean, in my head, I've developed the whole answer for this. Play into his prejudices. So I tell him, well, let me tell you a story. I said, you know how those like to gamble? Oh, yeah, yeah. You know how they like to shoot craps, shoot dice? Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, one night, I actually found in Motown records. You did? Oh, yeah, I did. I figure he either buys this, and I'm going to get away with it, or I'm going to be flying up the 3rd floor window.
Right.
And I said, well, one night, I got into a crap game with Berry Gordy, and I lost it all. I lost the company. Doesn't say anything. And I said, but they still let me hang around, and do things like this, with, newspapers and, and some TV. He thinks, that's the saddest thing I've ever heard. Wait a minute. Calls in the TV editor, calls in, a couple of the other head editors and said, look, I just heard a story, saddest thing I ever heard in my life. From now on, do whatever you can for this guy.
That's just amazing. Mark, give us a little perspective. These sound like flamboyant stories out of our past. But how big was record promotion in the music world in America back then?
Well, record promotion was huge. I mean, we have a time here, before the internet, when media communication was relatively consolidated. So, just a few TV stations, just a few local papers. And if you could get in the door of those major media markets, you reached everybody. I mean, these days it's so atomized. If you get in any, you have to be everywhere at all the times. But
right.
Al just had the chutzpah, really to pull off these stunts that grabbed people's attention.
And it was really life or death for an artist to get a record placed.
Absolutely. I mean, we look back at Motown and we think hugely successful companies. Probably the most successful in terms of rate of #1 records of any recording company in history. But they were a little operation operating out of basically a home in Detroit. And they were expanding gradually, but they could have gone out of business at any moment. And most, they were one of really dozens of little tiny record companies in Detroit, but they were the ones that hit it. And I think part of that magic was hiring Al. Having somebody out there, creating a buzz, making it look legitimate. And then Berry Gordy just had this knack for really being able to tell a story through music that was fresh, that grabbed, an integrated audience that sort of reached out to young America, which was really his target audience. I mean, people who didn't, their prejudices weren't so strong. They had friends, in high schools, and things were largely integrated at that point at the education world. And so to be able to tap into that with this beat that was just infectious, this Motown sound, this sound that's coming out of Detroit, that's coming out of the streets. And I think, it was just a magic combination.
Al has written a book called Hype and Soul. And this book, Al, when I read parts of it, I get the feeling that things really were run on a shoestring back then. Tell us a little story about just how cheap you were and how